All right, folks, we're gonna get started. Welcome to our Geospatial Forum for October 20th. My name is Aaron Hipp. I'm one of the associate directors in the CGA, Social and Behavioral Sciences. And so I'm excited to host a fellow social scientist today. So Dr. Maggie Sugg is joining us from Appalachian State University, where she's an associate professor in the Department of Geography and Planning. Her undergraduate degree, her master's, and her PhD are all from a blue school in Chapel Hill. So she got all 3 degrees in geography, or the latter 2 in geography at UNC. Maggie has adhered, John, to our protocol that our forum has come up with on how to formulate these presentations. So she's going to do a fair amount of introduction to herself and her background and her journey, apropos for the students here. So I won't spend too much time on that. But great individual meetings and a lunch meeting with the students today. So I appreciate everyone's time, and I'm excited to hear the next 2 hours. Yeah.
But yeah, thank you, Aaron, for hosting me. Always great to get off the mountain. I feel like an app, we're kind of like, even though we're in the same state, it's a totally different environment. So it's great to re-engage and be back in the triangle. Yes, I'm an associate professor at Appalachian, and today I am going to be talking about one of our larger projects, really looking at youth mental health. But to begin, I tried to adhere to this structure that John provided me, which was kind of unique for me to reflect upon. No one's really asked me in a really long time what led me to the geospatial perspective. And so I'll start from that perspective, and what Aaron already hinted at it. But like, I grew up in North Carolina, and like most in-state students on a budget, I attended an in-state school. It was a different in-state school than this one, UNC Chapel Hill. I did all 3 of my degrees there. I started off just, kind of as an undergrad, not knowing much about what's available in the job market. I started off with a biology and chemistry degree. I worked in a neuroscience lab with rats and feeding them cocaine and then looking at their brains. Very different than right now. And it was something when I got to my senior year, I took the MCAT, and I just couldn't bring myself to apply to med school. It just didn't seem right. And I kind of reflected upon what my favorite courses were, and they were actually geography. And so I did a total 360 and applied for a master's in geography. My parents were very upset with me. They have said it's been okay, but at the time they're like, what? Geography? What can you do with a geography degree? Anyway, that's where I headed. I was fortunate to get a position, a master's funding at the Southeastern Regional Climate Center, which is part of NOAA, to look at tropical cyclones, in particular looking at the impacts of tropical cyclones as they move inland. And so how those impacts change based off tropical cyclone attributes like the shape, the size, speed of movement, and the intensity. And I found this interesting. I liked the environmental aspect of it, but it was kind of like Goldilocks, rats, lab science, not my thing, too hot. Hardcore climatology, meteorology, too cold, wasn't quite right. It wasn't until I got to my PhD that I really found the merging of human and environmental systems, and that merging was really where my interests lie. So looking at these large scale systems, merging lots of data sets together to try to understand these really complex problems. And so my dissertation, I had an EPA STAR fellowship with it, looking in public health, looking at heat-related illnesses and tying them to temperature. So what temperatures do we see spikes in heat illness? And then also tying it to contextual and compositional place-based factors. So what locations do we see the highest heat illness? And at the time, so I graduated in 2015. At the time, most of the work with heat had been done in mortality data because that data is easier to access. It also had been done in urban environments, also due to data access and the urban heat island effect. Our work was kind of, was different and it was kind of novel in a way, in that we looked across an entire state and looked at rural environments and really highlighted that rural areas, particularly in the southeastern US, have higher heat vulnerability just to underlying factors like mobile homes, energy poverty, outdoor workers, all kind of these things that you all agree with now, but hadn't been done at that time. Luckily, I love the mountains, and so I saw a job opening when I was a PhD student, PhD candidate at App State. And I applied, it's my first job, and I applied and actually got it. So I went straight from UNC to App State. And from here, it was App State, unlike some of NC State, we have a really heavy teaching load. I had to do like 8 course preps in 2 years. It was crazy. And so I was trying to think of my research trajectory and where I wanted to go after that. And the thing that really came to mind was extending this heat-related illness work from like an ecology-based to more of an individual level, so looking at individual temperature. And again, this is in the past. At the time, a lot of the sensor work, looking at individual heat exposure, there hadn't been much studies. There had been some in 2002, a study out in Boston, 2015, one in Alabama. But I worked with a couple of colleagues, one at NC State here, and then another at Mississippi State. And we also extended the literature by looking at individual heat exposure. But unlike other studies, we used GPS coordinates and heart rate measurements to get individual heat strength. And so we merged a lot of these sensors together. And from a geographic perspective, this type of work addresses some of those limitations of geographic scale, particularly the uncertain geographic context problems, so understanding when and where exposure occurs. And we did this work, we had a lot of studies with it, and probably like 10 to 15 pubs. A lot of it was with outdoor occupational workers, so workers at these different universities, and we monitored them in both the winter and summer seasons. And we found a lot of significant variability among workers, and it really was much different. Their exposure was much different than the weather station, which we're used to using for epidemiological assessment. We did a lot of report back studies with them as well, seeing how they liked the results and if having their own individual heat exposure changed their behavior. Anyway, and then we did some cool mapping stuff comparing, individual heat exposure to land cover data. But as far as my career trajectory goes, this was like primary data collection, and it was very time intensive. One thing I didn't know is those outdoor occupational workers, particularly here in Raleigh, they start work at 4 a.m. Did you guys know that? And so for me to go meet them at Boone and we had to get up at like 3 and then go put on all these sensors on them and then come at the end of the day and collect it. It was really time intensive. And then I also had, a bunch of kids, so a 1-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 6-year-old, and I couldn't do it anymore. I was just like basically not sleeping. So that's where I kind of switched gears into secondary data collection and really focusing back to my roots of this climate health problem and trying to understand how climate is affecting health. And I would merge, I typically merge a lot of health data with a lot of climate data. And we've looked at a lot of different health outcomes. We've looked at vector-borne diseases, respiratory diseases. But one research gap that I really noted at the time, about 4 to 5 years ago, was mental health. At the time, there was very little work on a large scale looking at the connection between climate and mental health. And so as a young faculty member, that's where I decided to kind of focus my efforts. And that's where I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about the talk and some of the more traditional talk now. And so, yeah, mental health was something that was not known. And even like the geography of mental health is still really understood. So that's where I was interested in the climate mental health connection. But first I had to start off with where is their adverse mental health outcomes. And so that was kind of some of my first funded work was looking at those problems. And so that's what I'm going to talk about now for the rest of the talk. It's just the geospatial insights into youth mental health. And this has been funded through a couple organizations. I have a career grant with Human Environmental Geographic Sciences. I'm in the 3rd year of that. Had some funding for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. I also serve as a scientific advisor for them. And then when we get into the climate and mental health is when we have a couple NIH grants that looking at this particular problem. But yeah, switching gears. So this is how I started with mental health and how it became part of my geospatial perspective. But as you all know, and I'm sure you're well aware of, mental health is a significant burden. It's something that affects nearly 1/4 of individuals worldwide. And most of these disorders actually occur in adolescence. So they start by age 14 or age 24. And once they've been developed, they're much more likely to occur throughout someone's lifespan. And so it's definitely a significant health burden worldwide. Here in the US, suicide's one of the leading causes of death, and one of the reasons we're seeing declines in life expectancy across the US. Even in 2020, even before suicide, there's been 1.20 million suicide attempts. So it's a significant global health burden as well as a burden here in the US. Because it's a national crisis, the Surgeon General in 2021 did the unprecedented task of issuing an advisory, something that's never really been done before at this time. And with this mental health advisory, he really had a call to action to focus on adolescent mental health. And one thing that I noted in the advisory was, the need for multidisciplinary approaches. So he really made a call to action to use novel data sets, so digital data, shift the paradigm thinking of mental health, and need to have more multidisciplinary approaches of people working together to solve the problem. And in the advisory report, he really highlighted, the multi-scale, all these different scales and how they interlink to affect mental health. So there's complex linkages that occur at the individual, the family, the community, the environmental level, all working together that affects this youth mental health. And since this time, he's also issued another advisory about loneliness and isolation, which we're also working on. We have some unique data for that. But this, to me, was really like a call to action and really, a place where geographers and geospatial techniques can be applied. One problem when you're a medical geographer or you study health is that health data is just really difficult to access. And anyone who works with health data knows that. We have lots of strict regulations here in the US. If you are going to work with health data, a lot of times you have to go travel somewhere. I was talking to Erin today. You have to build in funding to go visit these locations. You have to buy health data sets. And even the health data sets we buy are real expensive and not great. Not great spatial coverage or at a good scale. And this is due to privacy concerns. So we have a lot of strict regulations with health data. Because of that, we also, there's also a lot of survey data with health, but with survey data, there's obviously also limitations. There's biasy with that. A lot of health analysis is also cross-sectional, so only at one time point, not longitudinal. There can be stigma with mental health, particularly among certain demographics. There's not a lot of research with Blacks and the stigma for seeking care for that demographic. And then it can be really hard to find causality. So it can be hard to find a causal association when you're looking at mental health. And so from my perspective, as someone who loves data and lots of data, big data provides a new opportunity for us as geospatial researchers to kind of investigate some of these health trends. And I'm going to talk about my talk 2 big data sets we're using to solve some of these, limitations and try to move the literature forward. And again, my talk, I'll focus on two main questions: the geographic patterns, so where spatially are adverse mental health conditions, and this is the focus of my career grant, and then a grant that I just wrapped up for the AFSP. And then an area that I'm moving more into is the climate implications. So what happens when there's a climate disaster or high temperatures? How does that affect mental health? And so the second question John gave, I just trying to adhere to this format, is what role did geospatial approaches play? I'm going to talk about two big approaches I'm using. One with the career grant, which is actually pretty simple, but novel if you're in the field of public health. And that is just simple clustering statistics. One of the big ones we use is a Coldroff spatial scan statistic. And this is a spatial scan statistic that takes a moving window, and you can change that size of that window. And you can look and identify clusters both retrospectively as well as prospectively. And you can do it both spatially and in space-time. And so one of our basic frameworks of our methodology is we'll identify the mental health outcome of interest, whether that be with mortality or morbidity data. And then we'll do our cluster analysis and SAT scan. So we'll identify spatial clusters or space-time clusters. So areas where we have much higher incidence of that health outcome than others. And then a second stage of the approach is we'll integrate both individual and community level data. So we're interested in knowing what are some of the compositional and individual drivers for cluster locations. So why do opioid disorders or suicide, why do those cluster in space? Why is there kind of a contagion effect at the individual level? And then what are some of the community drivers too? So is it structural racism, income segregation? What are some of the drivers in the contextual level that's also influencing cluster location? And we'll usually use just simple regression techniques to make that association. For repeated measures, we'll use generalized estimating equations, or with mortality data, we'll just use basic logistic regression. And so that's the basic framework, and that works well for me because I'm at an institution with predominantly undergrad and master's students, and so we can apply these techniques to a lot of different health outcomes. And like the state, like DHHS, they love it. So they love our maps. They love knowing where these clusters are, and they use it for some of their interventions, which is cool. But the data I'm predominantly using for this is three main sources. The first is NC Detect and SHEP's data. They're very similar. And this is kind of cool. The state of North Carolina, after 9/11, they had a mandate for all hospitals to report their emergency department data for bioterrorism, to prevent bioterrorism. It's like a surveillance technique. But it's great for us because all these hospitals are reporting their emergency department data, and so we can actually obtain it. And so with NC Detect and SHEP's data, I have complete spatial temporal coverage of North Carolina for emergency departments, except for military, Fort Bragg. And so we're able to get a really, this is really hard in some of the other states. A lot of times people have to piece together some of these hospital data, but we're able to obtain all of it. And we just have to, with the ED data, there's different diagnostic codes for why people attend to the ED. And we use those diagnostic codes to determine what type of health condition we want to look at. And so it's a pretty powerful data set. We have it from 2008, and we get a yearly update. So we're about to get 2022. And then for the mortality data, we use the North Carolina Violent Death Reporting System. And this includes both really detailed homicide and suicide information, very detailed, the manner of death, the location of death, the residential location of where that person lived. And that's also available through this data as well. And so these are our data sets that we're merging together to try to understand some of these health linkages. And so I'm kind of just going to do a show and tell of some of our studies we've done with using this methodology, using some of these data sets. One of the first studies we did for North Carolina that actually got some good press was looking at adolescent suicide. And again, from 2008 to 2018. And what we're doing again, is we're trying to identify areas with really high incidence of suicide. This is just a spatial cluster, not space-time. And it's always been considered that Western North Carolina is an area for high suicide, and that makes sense. Suicides tend to occur in mountain locations among white males. A lot of people hypothesize that's due to gun access. But what's interesting about our analysis is we showed that there's pretty high relative risk also in the eastern part of the state. And so that was unique, but we do see Western North Carolina also being highlighted. Within these clusters, we also have pretty good heterogeneity. So and all this analysis is done at the zip code level. And that's a limitation of health data, but it's pretty common. So we're limited to the zip code residential access. In addition to adolescent suicide, we use the emergency department data to also look at suicidal behaviors. So people going to the emergency department who also exhibit self-harm or suicidal ideation. And what was interesting is we see a very different pattern compared to suicide. We see it more in the eastern part of the state, some larger clusters. And again, heterogeneity within the clusters, and relative risk can get pretty high. So we're seeing locations that are very, very much at risk for suicidal behaviors. And a secondary question of this type of analysis is, what are the drivers of these geographic problems, patterns? So what are the compositional and contextual factors that influence cluster location? Oops. And a big one in the psychology literature, there's been a lot of work talking about urban and rural environments, and how in rural areas there's nearly double the suicide rate. But a real limitation of this analysis, a lot of it's done at the county level. The county is very coarse. And it's also done with a binary outcome. So urban, rural, 0, 1. And as you all know, there's a lot of, rurality. There's kind of a spectrum there. And no one had really studied that. And so what our group did is we used just the USDA RUCA codes to kind of get at this idea and their predefined definitions to try to understand what's the rural-urban continuum of some of these behaviors. We also look at some other measures like income segregation and structural racism as measured through the index concentration of extremes, which have been it's been popularized by Nancy Krieger out of Harvard. And some of the drivers that we see when we tie in some of this data is we see, and for me, adolescence is under age 24. I don't know if I said that. But we see that people, so youth, 24 and younger, that are associated with military have a much higher risk. So we see higher clustering, suicide clustering among military. We also see higher among Indigenous Americans, although our sample size is really small, so we need to subnote that. But a really interesting thing that we had a commentary wrote about our article too was this micropolitan. So when you compare it to urban areas, we actually see that it's not the most rural locations like you'd expect that see high suicide, but more of this like micropolitan, like, it's not, there's a little bit more nuance than just rural. And so that was a real interesting finding from our analysis. We also noted that it's predominantly low-income communities that see higher adolescent suicide, and we don't see a strong signal with structural racism. When we look at suicidal ideation or behaviors, we see higher clustering among Medicaid, so which can also be a proxy for poverty. We see lower risk for Black, so we see more white. Again, micropolitan being a risk factor, and then low income as well. And so this, just by providing a geospatial perspective, we were able to kind of, show risk a little bit more nuanced and a little bit finer resolution that had been done in the previous literature. And so we use this type of analysis for a couple different health outcomes. One thing we do with the Kulderoff spatial scan statistic is we can do a multivariate statistic. And so we can look at cluster co-occurrence in space-time. And so we can look at a couple different disorders. And one that we published on in spatial and spatial temporal epidemiology was looking at depression and suicidal behaviors among adolescents across North Carolina and seeing where they co-occurred. And interesting, overall, we saw decreases in emergency department visits for these two health outcomes when you compare the pre-pandemic to the post-pandemic. However, when you look at it geographically, we do see locations, particularly rural locations, that saw much higher ED visits for both outcomes. And so it was interesting that even though we see these decreases, when we look at the data at an aggregate level, it's very heterogeneous, and there's locations within North Carolina that saw particularly high mental health burden during the pandemic. From this, we can also look at areas that saw increases. So the red are increases that we saw, increases in depression after the pandemic, and blue are decreases. And it's hard to pick up the pattern. It's hard with the ZICTA or zip code data to pick out the pattern for me, but overall, we're just seeing an expansion of these conditions, particularly in rural ZICTAs. A newer area we're starting to get into is maternal mental health. And so maternal mental health, I would say, is also really understudied, even though it affects 20% of women during pregnancy. And we're looking at 3 different types of maternal conditions: perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, which are typically disorders that occur before pre-existing disorders, severe mental illness during pregnancy, and these are your really, really severe conditions like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. And we see a really high incidence of SMI. It's a pretty small sample size, but we see a much higher incidence for Black women, which suggests they're not being caught in some of these earlier precursor disorders. And then maternal mental disorders of pregnancy, which is a new condition that occurs during pregnancy. And so we're starting to map these, and we just had a paper published last week looking at locations, and we see very different populations at risk for these three types of disorders. We've also have a publication underway looking at the multivariate statistics, so trying to understand what occurred pre and post-pandemic for the 3 conditions. And what's interesting about this is overall we saw declines this is for the early pandemic, I should subset with that. We saw declines in the suicide rate and mental health overall in the early part of the pandemic. However, with maternal mental health, we saw overall increases. So we saw an increase among the subpopulation. And we can see that it changed depending on where you were. In North Carolina, we saw increases or decreases. In general, it was also a rural phenomenon. And currently we have I won't talk about it today, but we have a NIEHS grant to kind of link some of these conditions to temperature. And we're seeing at least a statistically significant relationship with these disorders and high temperatures. And I threw this in here because I knew Aaron was hosting me, but we've kind of skimmed the surface, and he can speak more about it than me for sure. With green space and mental health in North Carolina, I have a couple lower impact student pubs with it. And we were just interested in looking at green space as a potential low-cost mental health intervention. Now that I know more about green space, I know it's much more nuanced. It can cause climate gentrification and issues like that when it's implemented, but we just wanted to see if there was a relationship at the zip code level, the ZICTA level, between green space and mental health. And we used the PADIS data, so publicly accessible data, and then there's the national land cover data to try to get a private green space. And we noticed there was a statistically significant relationship. It was stronger with mental health conditions with private green space, or just the land cover data, particularly in urban environments, more so than rural. And I have a student on my career grant kind of digging into this a little bit more. I'd welcome any feedback, but she's looking at modifiers of the mental health conditions, looking at across the rural urban continuum. She's been trying to identify green space, like green space quantity, accessibility, and quality. This is the public green space she's using, and these are just maps of it at tertiles. But we're using quantity, so the amount of accessible, freely available green space, accessibility, so how accessible it is. And then quality, we try to operationalize as perimeter to area ratio. And again, welcome feedback. Overall, we see when we look at suicidal behaviors, we see it's more prevalent in suburban communities with low green space and also in small towns. We saw no significant relationship when we tried to look at green space quality. And according to my conversations with Aaron this morning, it's really hard to get at quality. So I guess, apparently this metric doesn't work either. And so we saw no significant associations. And then with accessibility, we saw an interesting relationship with urban environments. So as expected, if you have worse green space access, you had more suicidal behaviors among adolescents. We also saw signal in rural and isolated communities. We hypothesized that maybe this could be like economic, a lot of national parks, I don't know, something about that could potentially reduce mental health outcomes among that subpopulation. Anyway, so that's kind of like a survey of some of the work we're doing with geographic patterns in mental health. It's not very computational, but it is just by applying a geospatial lens, we are advancing some of the understanding of some of these conditions from a place-based perspective. For the next part of the talk, next 15 minutes, I was going to talk about the climate implications. So this is the focus of our NIH grant. And it's basically when you have a climate disaster, how does that affect mental health? And again, little is known about mental health and climate change and health is just this field that's really just developing really quickly, I would say, the last 5 years or so. But to me, climate change is taking these already existing health disparities, these mental health disparities, and amplifying them. And it's one of the bigger challenges from public health scientists in the 21st century. And from a mental health perspective, children, a lot of the literature, particularly coming out of Hurricane Katrina, children are some of the most likely to be affected by disasters, and particularly over really long time periods. Yet little is known about this population, but particularly in the backdrop of this mental health crisis and with other stressors like the COVID pandemic. And one area where we could potentially get some novel data, and it's actually feeling it's an intervention that helps youth, is text-based interventions. And so this population is not unlikely to use crisis phone lines. They're much more likely to text when they're in a crisis event than talk. And so text-based platforms have kind of gained a lot of popularity. And so because of that, one of the data sets we use for this NIH project is Crisis Text Line. And this was a nonprofit started in 2013. It's unique in that it has national coverage. And so basically what it is it's a text-based service where any adolescents, particularly people under 24, are the most likely to use it, will text in, and they'll be paired with a crisis counselor. That crisis counselor is a volunteer crisis counselor that's undergone 30 hours of training and is supervised by a mental health clinician. This type of service has been pretty widely used. And at the end of the crisis conversation, the counselor will tag that conversation as a suicidal behavior or depression. And over 80,000 people have used it. And a lot of people are repeat users. Again, it's mostly adolescents. It's nearly 9 million conversations. So it's a huge wealth of data. And one thing that makes it really exciting from a research perspective is we can get it in real time, near real time. So we can get a lot of health data. It has extremely long lags, so a year or two before that data is available. But with Crisis Text Line, we can get that data pretty near real time. And so we can get really situational awareness for what's going on. And these are the crisis conversations that we see that they can be coded as. We have normal risk, moderate risk, and high risk. For about 25% of the texters, they'll also fill out a demographic data, a survey at the end. And this will include age information, gender identity, and race and ethnicity. We can also add on questions, like I've just added on a question about zip codes. We added on questions during the COVID pandemic. I know 25% doesn't seem like that much. 25% of 9 million is actually a lot. And what's really cool from a data perspective is we also have information on sexual gender minorities, which is a really huge growing population, particularly among this demographic. With a lot of traditional health data, we don't have that information. And so I've reviewed a couple of grants, people trying to use like natural language processing of clinician notes to get at this identity information, but we actually have it within this data. In addition to the crisis text line data, we can also mine the conversations. If we have to go through a little bit stricter DUA, but we can use natural language processing to mine the conversations for things we're interested in. So we're working on a study right now to look at eco-grief. So people talking about eco-grief within their text conversation. And we've done a lot of work with crisis text line data. Some of our first work was just looking at this rural-urban disparities. It was published in 2018. A big one we've done is looking at some of like these external stressor events. So like the release of 13 Reasons Why. You guys remember that Netflix series? Yeah. And if that, so there was a lot of backlash about that and potential suicide contagion type effects. And we investigated it using a quasi-experimental framework and interrupted time series analysis. When we started this study, there was also a couple of celebrity suicides, and we found that actually the celebrity suicides were a bigger driver of suicidal ideation than the release of 13 Reasons Why. We also have done a lot of work with COVID-19 with this data set, and some of it was cited by the Surgeon General too. With the survey question, we had a couple questions about if you were an essential worker or if you were a child of an essential worker. And so once we had identified the people using the service that were either essential worker or a child of essential worker, we could do some analysis with that. Oops. Fortunately, it was just state level, but I threw those maps in there because you guys like maps. But we noted that with workers throughout the pandemic, so essential workers compared to non-workers of the same age using the same crisis text line service, we saw much higher rates of grief or bereavement, as well as suicide capability. For children of workers, we had an overall much higher crisis text line usage compared to children of the same age also using the service. And they were particularly high for substance abuse as well as grief. We also looked at spikes of COVID. So when we saw a spike of COVID, usually we would see a spike in crisis text line usage about, 28 days after we saw the spike in COVID. We also, some of the work we've done, this is just kind of showing it before we talk about the climate. We'll use the cold drop spatial scan statistic to look at bereavement, so grief throughout the pandemic. And we noted that these space-time clusters of grief corresponded to right after when we saw spikes in COVID-19. And then we did some more advanced latent class analysis, which is a method commonly used in psychology. And we're hoping to map back some of these latent classes to locations to inform it more with a geospatial perspective. But one of the projects we currently have funded is to look at the causal association with climate disasters. We look at a couple different storms that I'll go through. One was Hurricane Florence in 2018. We'll talk about Hurricane Laura in 2020, the wildfires in 2020, with the winter weather in Texas, and then high temperature. And the methodology, the geospatial methodology I'm using is, some of it, the interrupted time series is not very geospatial, but the difference is these are trying to get at quasi-experimental techniques. So trying to really highlight, we're trying to simulate an experiment to figure out that causal mechanism, that causal association. And with quasi-experimental, we're using either two types, the interrupted time series analysis, where you have your baseline period, and then you use like an ARIMA model to forecast it, and then you compare your predicted to your forecasted. It was commonly used in like economic geography, but we're applying it here to like, big natural experiments like a hurricane or the pandemic or the release of 13 Reasons Why. These kind of external stressors, what do we see? And then another approach we're using is, I call it a spatial DID. I think economists also call it that, where we look at the difference. We have an exposed location and we compare it to a non-exposed location. The first difference, and then we compare the time period of the storm or the winter or the climate disaster to a control time period. So two differences, and that type of research design is also quasi-experimental. And again, using crisis text line data. And overall, crisis text line data seem to be pretty representative racially. We have really good coverage with Indigenous Americans, and not so great coverage with Black. Oh, I guess it's pretty good. Yeah, it's gotten better. And so some of the storms we've looked at, the first is Hurricane Florence. So you guys should be familiar with this. I'm sure you guys do work with Florence too. Now this was a 1 in 1,000 year event. We considered our exposure locations with both individual and public assistance. And we did some really fancy, I know you never should show a table, but this is a table showing our REMA modeling. And basically what we saw was overall, we didn't see a significant trend when you looked at all crisis outcomes. But when you looked at specific ones, like more severe ones, like suicidal thoughts, we saw an increase, 23% increase after Hurricane Florence, 6 weeks after Florence. And we saw increase in anxiety and stress. What was cool with this study is that we have all that really rich ED data, emergency department data. And so we were able to duplicate, we used the exact same methods and we did it on our ED data. And we saw really similar trends. And so to us, this kind of validated using crisis text line as a source of health data, which is exciting because it didn't have the same restrictions as our health data does. And it also has that real-time capability. And I'll fly through some other studies like a show and tell. We looked at the winter wildfires in 2020 out west. And what was interesting about this is there was also the COVID pandemic going on. And I was interested to see, like, what is the driver of mental health? Do we see an increase with the wildfires, with this concurrent COVID-19 pandemic co-occurring? And overall, we did see an increase, but it was not a statistically significant increase. The real statistically significant increase we saw was for the COVID pandemic. We did not see that same increase for wildfires. And we did both the interrupted time series analysis as well as a difference in difference to show that quasi-experimental association. Another study we did was with Hurricane Laura. And for this one, we were looking at a couple different events altogether. We looked at the COVID-19 pandemic, the George Floyd protests, Hurricane Laura, and then the 2020 presidential election, trying to see which one do we see like the worst mental health outcomes, short-term mental health outcomes. And overall, we do see increases for some of these events. However, when we use our quasi-experimental, we saw a much higher mental health response following social stressors, like the 2020 presidential election, like blew it out of the water, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic. And we do see an association with Hurricane Laura, but it's not nearly the magnitude, and the significance is not nearly to the same degree. Most recently, I just published a study looking at the power crisis and winter weather event in Texas and signs of the total environment. Again, we're looking at difference in difference, and as well as interrupted time series analysis. And overall, this study was unique in that we looked over a much longer time period. We looked almost up to 1 year. And we saw increases in conversations and thoughts of suicide early on. And then on longer time spans, we saw increases in total conversations like near the anniversary of the event. And then another area we're starting to look into is high temperatures. And so for some reason, that's not quite totally unknown. We see increases in suicide and mental health with really high temperatures. And so we were curious to see if we would see it with the crisis text line data. We are using a different approach here, a distributed lag nonlinear model. And we did note with really high temperatures, particularly in cities in the northern latitudes like New York, we see a strong association. So with high temperatures, there's high relative risk for help-seeking behavior with crisis text line. However, when we go to some of these more southern latitude locations, like Atlanta, and then we've looked at our ED data too, emergency department data, we don't see a really significant result, or it's really, really small, you know, so it doesn't seem like the signal's quite as strong, which is interesting when you look at it geographically. We've done some fancy modeling too, showing that overall we see a J-shaped relationship. So with higher temperatures, we are seeing crisis text line usage, but it is very place dependent depending on where you're looking at it. And we've replicated it for North Carolina. We've used a little bit different approaches, and overall, again, it's not nearly significant as some of those northern cities like New York or Chicago. Okay, and then a newer study that we're starting to get into is looking at underrepresented populations. So there's really a dearth of literature looking at climate disasters and sexual gender minorities. And so we have a study under review looking at Hurricane Ian, which hit last year, Florida, and looking at mental health for these youth post-Ian, compared to similar youth using the same service that are not sexual gender minorities. And overall, we see higher suicide ideation, intent, and depression among, some of these more severe outcomes among these minority populations. And this is interesting just because it's never really been studied before. So we're one of the first groups to put this forth. But thinking about next steps, I think, you know, digital platforms like crisis text line and the new 988, which is the government bipartisan, kind of like 911, but for mental health. It's kind of a scalable intervention, and it allows us to do real-time geospatial surveillance, which is exciting. Some other big future of geospatial analytics, I think climate and health is still a field there's still a lot of science that's not known. Also, like precision public health or health surveillance. So just pinpointing where conditions are is something that's very much needed, and something that we can readily do as geospatial scientists. Yeah, again, health surveillance, to me, this idea of using crisis text line, and then we've recently partnered with VA Link out in the Gulf. This can give us like real-time indicators on the health of a population, which is exciting. And then again, I know this is said a lot, but as a geospatial scientist, I think we're like uniquely set up to address some of these wicked problems. You know, I think merging multiple data sets, you know, human and environmental systems, embracing complexity, convergent science, which is really big with NSF, all these things are the future, you know, and working across disciplines. And that's like a unique perspective that you guys can all bring to the teams you work with. Some final remarks. Yeah, so we see risk factors for youth vary across the rural urban continuum. We see increases after climate disasters. Overall, like my final parting is, I think there's an important place for geographers to address the youth mental health crisis. We can provide a unique perspective that's not seen in the psychology or some of the public health literature. Also, I'd like to thank my team. I actually work really closely with Jen Runkle at NC State, but like me, she's in Western North Carolina. So we're kind of like off. She works at the North Carolina Cooperative Institute for Climate Studies. I have two colleagues at App State, Kurt Michael and Marty Thompson, they're psychologists. And then I have a team of undergraduate and master's students that have helped with this work. I am recruiting students, so if you know any interesting undergrads who would be interested in this work, I'm happy to train your undergrads into master's students and then send them back here. So send them to me. We have a couple, openings. I have some newer grants, 3 new grants looking at maternal health and child health, and then some existing grants looking at mental health. So yeah, please, I would love to take your students and to train them in these methods and then ship them back. So thank you for your time too. You have any questions? I'm happy.
No, speak
Go ahead.
loud. Speak loudly.
No,
The
it's-
microphone. Oh, okay. Thank you. Your work is incredibly important. Thanks for everything you do.
Oh, thank you.
My question is a bit more about gaps and related to the idea of the crisis text. Right now, we have online platforms that would connect a patient with a mental health provider. So I'm curious about who's not searching for that information or those resources.
Yeah.
And where are the gaps on it? Where we don't see folks searching for help?
Yeah.
Basically, and how we can then connect with them. Yeah, be more active, because one thing is when you're ready to reach out to that text line or when you're prepared to reach out to a mental health provider.
Yeah.
But what happens to everyone else that's not capable nor not in a place where they can reach for that help?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and that's like outside my perspective. I think there's like two parts to your question. You know, the government's really trying to do this 988 number. So it's just like 911. It becomes like, you know, common knowledge when you have a crisis, you can just dial 988, but it's only been around for 1 year. So most of the funding for that has been around dissemination. So trying to reach different populations. One problem I have with crisis text line is, you know, it's just crisis conversations. It doesn't give someone like a reference for a real mental health provider, like a point of care. And that's why we've started to team up with the EIA Link, which is this cool program in Louisiana where they'll actually put you in contact with a mental health provider. And if you can't afford one, they'll help you. And they're using that program. Florida's is about to adopt it too. So I think it's moving in that direction. But yeah, that's an area that we don't know what's going on and there needs to be more done. But it's hard, there's stigma, you know. Yeah, and that's like when we were starting, like we just submitted an R1, we're starting to work with community groups to help get that message out with actual providers who work in the community who can help us address that problem. And so that's the next stage of our work if we get it funded.
Thank you.
Yeah, big one.
Not like you need additional ideas. You have to cover a wealth of
No.
research, but it's not another idea either.
Yeah, no, I think we were trying to do that already. You hit the big limitation. So good one.
So as I understand it, the Texas crisis text line has the data that you get is pre-labeled. Well, it's just the statistics around it, right? You don't get any of the text.
I can, but I haven't for that. Most of the work I've showed, for my R15 grant, I have not analyzed.
Because that's a really valuable set of text labeled by experts. Right, and you said that afterwards they say, you know, this person's suicidal, this person's.
Yeah, they are the ones who market.
Yeah, so that's like, could be a really great training set for detecting posts on other types of media that sound like that person is in danger.
Yeah, that'd be really cool. And we do have the text conversation too, and you can mine that for more information. I don't have that manpower.
Yeah, so that's
You're talking to an expert.
Oh,
Yeah.
maybe you do.
Collaborate.
I had a question about the transgender youth.
Yeah.
I remember on the time at the end of that year, there was a lot of bills and legislation going on in the state to gender affirming care. I didn't know if you had looked at any of that in relation to there's any like.
Yeah. I mean, that was a huge thing because it was like, it would definitely, the great thing about the interrupted time series though, is the ARIMA model will kind of adjust for that. And so we use that baseline to do the forecast. But that was an area because my student led that work. She wanted to look into it a little bit more because when she looked at the time series, there was a notable jump for all that political legislation that was ongoing. Yeah, but yeah, that's a limitation, but that study design is usually pretty good at adjusting for those trends. Yeah.
Question, or I guess more so a comment, related to the green space and mental health work. As far as the quality of green spaces, and one, I guess, how are you all defining quality? And then, because that's something that I think about a lot, being someone who grew up like in Chicago and seeing like so many different variety of green spaces, and just anecdotally noticing that the types of green spaces that were located in my neighborhood were very different than green spaces in other like more suburban areas. So when getting at that that angle of quality, I was wondering if maybe you could look at like use, green space use, or incorporate that into some type of measure of quality, because I know some places have multiple uses, but I've been really interested in like the types of green spaces that are located in different neighborhoods and how that impacts.
Like if there's like a playground and things like that.
Right, like if it's a football field versus a football or soccer field versus a trail system or a park or like a playground or a I don't know, like some other like a lake or like some other use.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a great idea. We really struggled with quality. We tried to do Google reviews, but I know Aaron's like the expert back there. Yeah, but that wasn't very successful. So I like your idea though of looking at what the park has. And we just used a quick perimeter to area ratio because it was like the easiest to do, but I don't think it was ideal. So, yeah, I agree with you. Thank you. That's
I agree with everyone else. Thank you for your talk. And I think your work is super important. When you're doing difference in differences, what criteria do you use to make sure that two locations, one that was affected by a natural disaster and one that wasn't, are similar enough to be compared?
yeah, the parallel trends assumption.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's like a test you can do, and then a lot of times we'll do the placebo test too, where we do like different time periods to see, there's like parameters that you do. And there's like some newer R packages that will also test it for you. Luckily, I work with an economist who's also like a difference in difference expert. They're so good at difference in difference. Yeah, but those are the first thing I'll do is just to like look at the time series, that's your first test. And then we'll do like the placebo test where I take different time periods. And then there's like within some of these packages, you could actually statistically test it too. So yeah, but you have to be very careful because if you don't meet that assumption of trends, you cannot say it's a causal association. But you can still report it. I have a study where we didn't meet the assumption of trends. And I just said it in the paper. It's still interesting, I think. We had an argument if we should publish it or not. And I was like, I think we should go for it. It's still interesting, even if it's not causal. And it did get published. So I think it's still worthwhile, even if it doesn't meet it. Yes.
Do you mind closing with a bit more about the so what, like how you're sharing this back with like as a science advisor, and how you're disseminating the work and maybe changing some policies and programs?
Yeah. So I presented a couple of times to the Department of Health and Human Services. And then we got funding because of some of those adolescent suicidal behavior and suicide maps. We got actually funding for a public health AmeriCorps program that we perform psychological first aid. So it's like train the trainer into those counties of Western North Carolina. So we did some of that. Yeah, and I give presentations a lot, like to the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention. And I have an NSF funded intern at DHHS who does a lot of this mapping for them. They really appreciate that. So those are some ways. I want to get better at it, but I'm hoping to grow into that more. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Maggie, for your time. Appreciate it. Thank you. He invites us all to the mountain.